introduction, and I'm happy to, because I think this is going to be a really great presentation. Let me introduce you to our speaker today, and then I'll just hand it right on over. Michael Cangemi. He spells his name with a G, so it's confusing. Michael Cangemi is with us today from New York to present with the killer president of Guatemala, Reconsidering, Ambassador Frank Ortiz, who many people in this room knew personally. Let's see. He received his MA in History and an MA in Liberal Studies and is now a PhD candidate with an anticipated completion of that PhD in 2017 from Binghamton University in New York State. Most of your work, and I'm really interested to hear this talk, most of your work is focused on Guatemala and U.S. relations under the umbrella of the Catholic influence under Reagan and also Carter, I believe. And he is currently teaching courses in U.S. history, in U.S. diplomatic history, has numerous awards and grants and fellowships that have enabled him to do the research that he'll be presenting today, some of which was conducted here at our library, at the Chavez Library, and we're fortunate to have him back with us today to present some of that work. And I will just hand it on over right to him, and thank you all for coming today, and help me welcome Michael.
The problem with such a nice introduction like that is it harbors an expectation. And also for the record, the last time I did one of these, we drew exactly 4 people. So this is a much nicer turnout. So thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you, Meredith, for that lovely introduction, and also Tomas for organizing this series. Tomas has asked me for the last 2 years to be a part of this, and I'm thrilled that our schedules finally aligned to bring me back. I'd like to just make a few very brief points before I begin. First, my talk today stems from my doctoral research, as Meredith pointed out, which examines the ways that politically liberal Catholics in Guatemala and the United States influenced the trajectory of U.S.-Guatemalan relations during the Carter and Reagan administrations. That said, today's talk moves slightly away from the religious aspects of my research, and instead will focus on the structure of U.S. diplomacy during the late 1970s. You are the first audience to hear this particular part of my work, which is simultaneously exciting and terrifying for me, because in the span of the next hour or so, I'm going to find out if any of this makes any sense to anyone but me. Second, I would like to just take a moment to address the title of my talk, specifically the word reconsidering. My aim today is not to present an in-depth analysis of Frank Ortiz's diplomatic career, his politics, or his personality. Instead, I will be talking today about the administrative circumstances of his recall from Guatemala in 1980, because it was part of a larger debate within the Carter administration over human rights and its place within U.S. foreign policy. Historians have begun to examine this topic in much greater detail in recent years, and have already generated a wealth of insightful scholarship that re-examines these complex issues. And I do hope to contribute to that scholarship in some small way. So with that out of the way, all disclaimers aside, let's begin. On July 17th, 1979, Frank Ortiz Jr., a career State Department officer, presented his credentials as the new U.S. ambassador to Guatemala.
We can't hear.
Is that better?
No.
Is the microphone not working?
Not working.
It's working. It just needs more volume.
Yeah.
Where is the knob?
Okay. Let's press pause. Sorry.
That's okay. Sorry about that.
I'm going to speak loud. Try speaking loudly, and I'll get this replaced.
Okay. Is that better? Is
Yes.
that? All right. from New York. We're loud people, so there shouldn't be too much of a challenge. All right, let's start again. On July 17, 1979, Frank Ortiz Jr., a career State Department officer, presented his credentials as the new U.S. ambassador to Guatemala to Guatemalan President Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia. Prior to his posting in Guatemala, Ortiz served the State Department in multiple capacities between 1951 and 1979, including Deputy Executive Secretary of State from 1975 to 1977, and ambassador to Barbados and Grenada from 1977 to 1979. Ortiz's ambassadorship roughly coincided with the beginning of an approximately decade-long wave of state-sanctioned violence that constituted the bloodiest period in Guatemala's 36-year civil war, which occurred between 1960 and 1996. Beginning in 1978, the number of reported murders, abductions, and torture cases attributed to Guatemala's military and civil defense forces skyrocketed and raised questions about the efficacy of the Jimmy Carter administration's human rights-based foreign policy. The Lucas government's human rights abuses created diplomatic tension with the Carter administration and, according to news reports at the time, were responsible for Ortiz's recall as ambassador on August 6th of 1980. Several U.S. and Guatemalan press accounts reported that Ortiz's recall was due to concerns that he had formed an excessively close relationship with Lucas and Guatemala's other right-wing political leaders, and that this relationship had undermined the Carter administration's diplomatic objectives with Guatemala. This explanation is inaccurate. Instead, my talk today argues that while Ortiz was unsuccessful in persuading the Lucas regime to halt its rampant human rights abuses, his failure was the end product of the Carter administration's human rights-based foreign policy model. As I hope to demonstrate, the administration's foreign policy was beset by multiple theoretical and practical problems that impeded Ortiz's diplomatic mission to Guatemala. Ortiz called attention to those problems as early as 1977, even before his ambassadorship commenced. He contended, especially, that the United States had little diplomatic leverage to negotiate with the Lucas government. Furthermore, many of Ortiz's cables and telegrams as ambassador demonstrated that he was extremely distrustful of and hostile toward Lucas, referring to him on the back of this photograph as the killer president of Guatemala. Indeed, Guatemala offers a useful case study for understanding the practical limits of the Carter administration's diplomatic influence, especially in Central America. Fundamental differences in how governments in Central America and the United States define human rights facilitated Central American governments' suspicion of a human rights-based foreign policy as a form of U.S. interventionism. This was particularly apparent in Guatemala, owing in part to the United States' history of direct and indirect intervention in the country's domestic affairs. Further, Guatemala was able to counterbalance the Carter administration's arms and economic sanctions more successfully than other Central American states. Successive Guatemalan governments were able to offset the absence of U.S. military assistance by purchasing more arms and munitions from other states, as well as from private U.S. manufacturers. Similarly, Guatemala was able to secure large development loans from multinational banks in the late 1970s, despite the United States' criticism of Guatemala's human rights record. These developments ultimately diluted the Carter administration's diplomatic influence in Guatemala and across Central America, and contributed to its inability to address the region's political and human rights crises in an effective manner. They also suggest that Ortiz's recall was part of much larger bureaucratic and diplomatic problems within the Carter administration, specifically that by the late 1970s, the diplomatic apparatus within the Carter administration, specifically that by the late 1970s, the diplomatic apparatus that the United States government had utilized throughout the Cold War was administratively and ideologically unprepared to fully integrate human rights into foreign policy formation and implementation. My talk today investigates these issues by first summarizing U.S. human rights policies enacted during the early 1970s and how they fostered diplomatic tensions with the Guatemalan government, beginning in 1976. Specifically, I will discuss how Ortiz, as Deputy Executive Secretary of State, argued that Guatemalan President Shell Eugenio Lauderdale Garcia's refusal of U.S. military aid in 1977 was indicative of the Carter administration's lack of meaningful leverage with Guatemala and other Latin American states on diplomatic matters. I will also provide a brief account of Guatemala's political violence during the late 1970s to contextualize the human rights crisis that Ortiz inherited as ambassador in 1979. I will then detail how State Department bureaucracy and Guatemala's political unrest hamstrung Ortiz's attempt to engage Lucas diplomatically and how this hastened his recall. Finally, I'll recount the aftermath of his recall and Guatemala's increasing human rights abuses during the early 1980s to situate Ortiz's ambassadorship within the larger historical trajectory of U.S.-Guatemala relations. The diplomatic issues that would ultimately lead to Ortiz's recall were rooted in U.S. policymakers' increased interest in human rights throughout the 1970s. As a consequence of the 1970 congressional midterm election, 4 key House Foreign Affairs subcommittees received new chairmen for Congress's 1971 session. Is that better? All right. The new leadership, including international organizations and social movement subcommittee chairman Donald Frazier of Minnesota, and Foreign Economic Policy Subcommittee Chairman John Culver from Iowa, sought to incorporate human rights issues and greater congressional influence into U.S. foreign policy in what the Washington-based magazine National Journal described as a, quote, more critical appraisal of U.S. foreign policy from the House than anyone on Capitol Hill can recall. The subcommittee's influence was most visible in the increased number of House Foreign Affairs Committee hearings on human rights, which jumped from just 2 in 1971 to over 30 between 1973 and 1976. 2 key pieces of legislation passed during the mid-1970s reflected congressional efforts to create a human rights-based foreign policy. The first was Iowa Representative Tom Harkin's amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act in 1975, which prohibited U.S. military assistance to governments engaged in persistent gross human rights violations. The second was the International Financial Institutions Act of 1977, or IFIA, which prohibited the United States from contributing to development loans issued by multinational institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank to states engaged in human rights violations. Together, the Harkin Amendment and IFIA made the United States' 2 biggest foreign policy incentives, military and economic assistance, conditional on states' compliance with international human rights statutes. These changes also prompted Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to authorize the creation of the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs and named James Wilson as its initial secretary in 1975. Kissinger, an ardent critic of human rights, approved the Bureau's creation in an effort to deter Congress from passing further human rights-based foreign policy legislation like the Harkin Amendment and restore the insular, executive-based diplomatic model of the Nixon administration. Although Kissinger's authorization institutionalized human rights within the foreign policy-making process, he actively blocked the Bureau from making any meaningful contributions to U.S. diplomacy by denying all of Wilson's proposals as Bureau Secretary. As an entity, the Bureau would not exert any influence over foreign policy until the Carter administration, under the leadership of Wilson's successor, Patricia Darien, beginning in August of 1977. Human rights were also a focus of Carter's presidential campaign in 1976. As a candidate, Carter made frequent references to morality and human rights while outlining his foreign policy proposals on the campaign trail. One notable example came during his address to the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations on March 15th of that year, when he stated, quote, "It must be the responsibility of the President to restore the moral authority of this country in its conduct of foreign policy. Policies that strengthen dictators or create refugees, policies that prolong suffering or postpone racial justice weaken that authority. Policies that encourage economic progress and social justice promote it," unquote. In that same address, Carter also lamented previous administrations' interventionism, noting that, quote, "For years, we were the only free nation with the military capacity to keep the peace.
but we also had the power to make or break regimes with adroit injections of money or arms, and we sometimes used this power in ways that were less commendable, end quote. Guatemala was one such regime. Following the CIA-engineered overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in June 1954, successive US presidential administrations exerted a measure of influence on Guatemala's domestic politics. This influence took a number of forms, including the Lyndon Johnson administration's economic and technical support for Guatemala's national police forces, which spawned extra-legal death squads like the infamous Mano Blanco and Hoyo por Hoyo, and the Richard Nixon administration's approval of $12 million in arms and 8 aircraft for President Carlos Arana Osorio in 1970, which Arana used to wage an extermination campaign against the country's political left in 1971 and 1972. The United States' resurgent interest in human rights complicated US-Guatemalan relations in 2 ways. The first was that Lagarud saw US human rights advocacy as a pretext for continued intervention in Guatemala's domestic politics. In June 1976, the Lagarud government issued a statement to the US House of Representatives International Organization Subcommittee, which said that as a sovereign power, Guatemala could, quote, never accept directives or allow interference in its national problems, since this domain belongs exclusively to Guatemalans themselves, end quote. On March 11th of the following year, Lagarud directed the Guatemalan government to preemptively refuse any US military assistance to Guatemala that was contingent upon his government's compliance with US human rights standards. The Lagarud government's refusal was significant because Guatemala was Central America's largest recipient of US military aid and direct arms sales. Between July 1970 and September 1976, the Guatemalan government had received approximately $21.3 million in aid under the US Defense Department's military assistance program and direct arms sales. In comparison, Honduras purchased $6.3 million of arms directly from the US during this period, while El Salvador received less than $3 million in military assistance funding and direct sales combined. During this period, Guatemala received 70% of all US military assistance to Central America. The Lagarud government just a breakdown of those numbers. The Lagarud government outlined its grievances with the Carter administration in an official statement carried in the national daily newspaper Prensa Libre on March 18, 1977, noting in part that, quote, in the history of the inter-American system, the principle of non-intervention has been consecrated as one of the state's fundamental duties, and any undue interference by one has always been rejected, even if the interference was for altruistic purposes, end quote. Guatemala was one of 5 Latin American states to refuse US military assistance over human rights issues within a 4-week period. Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil declared their refusals on February 28th, March 3rd, and March 5th, respectively, while El Salvador followed suit on March 17th. These refusals, alongside increased civil and political unrest in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, prompted Carter administration officials to order a presidential review committee to analyze US policies toward Latin America. Numerous agencies, including the State Department, Department of Defense, and CIA, joined White House officials on the committee to review major policy problems that included human rights, arms proliferation, US responses to regional political unrest, and economic development. Representative of its diplomatic importance to the new Carter administration, Latin America was the only region in the world to undergo an administrative policy review. The committee submitted its conclusions in a report dated March 12, 1977, one day after the Guatemalan government's refusal of military assistance, and was signed by Ortiz. The report's findings on human rights highlighted the second complication in US-Guatemalan relations, namely that US policymakers restricted their definition of human rights to include civil and political liberties only, while Latin American intellectuals and jurists privileged economic and social equality as human rights' foundational values. The report emphasized the differences in how the United States and Latin America defined human rights, and warned that these differences left the Carter administration with little meaningful diplomatic leverage with states like Guatemala on human rights issues. On the topic of human rights, the report noted that, quote, "The United States and Latin America tend to view human rights from different perspectives. We emphasize political rights, from habeas corpus to freedom of assembly and speech. The Latins admire our political freedoms, but believe economic and social rights are more important to most of their citizens, particularly the poor. Our concern for fundamental political rights is thus out of phase with the appeals and ideologies of most of the developing world," end quote. This analysis underscored two developments that have been unfolding throughout Latin America, especially in Guatemala, with respect to human rights since the 1960s. First, Latin Americans' increasing association of socioeconomic rights with human rights was fueled by the Latin American Catholic Church's political liberalization and individual Catholics' rise to prominence as human rights advocates. This advocacy took on many forms in Guatemala, including individual clergy and lay Catholics' more visible leadership roles in labor unions, establishment of cooperative farms in several parishes, and celebrating Mass and translating the Bible into local Mayan dialects. These measures alarmed the Arana and Loggerud governments, which viewed the church's liberalization as an alleged product of Marxist influence. In response, both governments enacted repressive measures against Guatemala's liberal Catholics that included a range of human rights violations, including police harassment and intimidation, abduction, and murder. The second development was that the ideological disjunction between the United States and Latin America on human rights allowed the Loggerud government to claim that the Carter administration's subordination of socioeconomic rights was an attempt to shape other states' political institutions to mirror those of the United States. As Ortiz would later note as ambassador, such claims stoked Guatemalan nationalism and anti-Americanism and were predicated on the Arbenz coup's legacy. The Loggerud government was thus able to frame the Carter administration's human rights policies as part of a larger historical pattern of U.S. intervention in Guatemala's political affairs. Human rights concerns became paramount in U.S.-Guatemalan relations by 1978, when Lucas's fraudulent election coincided with increased activity from Guatemala's militant left. Groups like the Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes and Ejército Guerrillero de los Pobres began to reemerge in the country's northern and western regions after several years of dormancy, while a relatively new group, the Organización Revolucionaria del Pueblo en Armas, publicly declared war on the Guatemalan government in January 1978. Prior to taking office on July 1st of that year, Lucas, who then U.S. Ambassador Davis Boster described as, quote, a rather parochial nationalist with a flat public personality, offered amnesty for leftists that wished to surrender to government forces, but declared that those who refused the amnesty would be pursued vigorously. Lucas's vigor proved especially brutal. According to a report published by Amnesty International in 1979, some 500 corpses were discovered across the country during Lucas's first 6 months in power. 200 of them exhibited signs of torture. Further, according to the Guatemalan Archdiocese's comprehensive report on Guatemalan human rights violations, an additional 7,061 recorded cases of politically motivated murder and abduction occurred during the remainder of Lucas's presidency from 1978 to 1982. This total included 158 recorded massacres in which the military destroyed entire villages as part of a scorched earth policy carried out by the defense minister, General Manuel Benedicto Lucas Garcia, the president's brother. By 1979, Carter administration officials viewed the Lucas regime's increasingly bloody repression as one part of a triptych of unrest that included El Salvador's intensifying civil war and the final months of Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution. The turmoil prompted administration officials to convene a second presidential review committee that re-examined U.S. policy objectives in Central America in light of these crises. The committee, which included Ortiz, met at the White House on June 11th and was the administration's final major policy review on Guatemala prior to Ortiz's posting as ambassador the following month. The committee showed a surprisingly facile understanding of Guatemala's political and human rights conditions in an historical context. According to the committee meeting minutes, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher characterized the Lucas government as, quote, a stable and conservative one which apparently sanctions official assassinations, quote. While Christopher's point about the state-sanctioned murder was undeniably accurate, His description of the Lucas government as stable contradicted multiple cables and telegrams from Boster and John T. Bennett, Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City. Their reports noted Lucas's unpopularity and questioned his chances for political survival. Christopher also asked how the Carter administration could best encourage the Lucas government to improve its human rights practices. While Christopher, Assistant Secretary of State of Inter-American Affairs Byron Vakey, and Deputy Secretary of Defense Charles Duncan all argued that extending development loans and non-tactical military equipment transfers were suitable incentives, Ortiz disagreed. He argued that the Carter administration had, quote, very little leverage with the Lucas regime on loans or hardware because both the Loggerud and Lucas governments had been able to offset that loss of U.S. military assistance by securing arms and equipment from other states, most notably Israel. Following the Loggerud government's refusal of U.S. military assistance in 1977, the Israeli government became Guatemala's chief weapons supplier and completed a litany of arms sales to the country, including also an ELTA radar system, 5 missile patrol boats, tanks, and armored cars. Additionally, the Loggerud and Lucas governments refitted the entire Guatemalan army with Israeli-made Galil rifles by the end of the decade at a cost of $6 million. Further, the Harkin Amendment's prohibitions on arms transfers did not extend to commercial transactions by private companies. As this chart shows, the Lucas regime purchased 750 firearms, over 3 million rounds of ammunition, 24,000 rounds of artillery shells, and over 6,000 tear gas grenades in 11 separate purchases between August 1977 and December 1978 from companies like Smith & Wesson, International Armament Corporation, and Aircraft Armaments Incorporated. In each case, the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs and the White House reviewed and approved each sale before they were completed. Ortiz cited the Guatemalan government's ability to secure arms from both foreign governments and private U.S. contractors to argue that the Lucas regime had little incentive to comply with the Carter administration's wishes because it had no reason to amend its human rights practices as long as there were other avenues to obtain arms. Thus, the continued flow of arms into Guatemala from multiple sources represented the practical limit of the Carter administration's human rights-based foreign policy. Ortiz assumed his post as ambassador to Guatemala 1 month after the committee meeting. A State Department press release dated July 12, 1979, praised Ortiz as a career diplomat whose, quote, years of working in Latin America and his lifelong interest in the area made him an ideal candidate for the ambassadorship. The press release also alluded to Ortiz's reputation for candor and stated that Guatemala's strategic importance to the United States required an ambassador capable of frank, open dialogue on diplomatic issues. However, correspondence from late 1979 highlighted the State Department's contradictory policies toward Guatemala and Ortiz's Sisyphean task as ambassador. Documents from this period include Ortiz's assessment of Guatemala's increasingly unstable social conditions and the ways that the Carter administration's human rights policies contributed to the country's instability. These documents also noted that policymakers in Washington understood that significant differences existed in what the U.S. and Guatemalan governments defined as human rights, and that competing bureaus within the State Department disagreed on whether the Lucas government was also responsible for stopping the Guatemalan left's human rights abuses, as well as state-sanctioned violations. Ultimately, this correspondence foregrounded the State Department's inability to provide Ortiz with clear direction on how to engage Lucas on human rights issues, and left Ortiz with no viable diplomatic leverage in his negotiations with the Lucas government. One of Ortiz's earliest telegrams as ambassador noted some of these problems. On September 4th, he issued a lengthy account of his first impressions of Guatemala, human rights concerns, and the state of U.S.-Guatemalan relations. Writing about his initial impressions of the country's populace, Ortiz claimed that, quote, dominant Guatemalans see themselves as increasingly isolated as the international target of a Marxist-inspired, hostile, coordinated campaign. It helps create a siege mentality. It strengthens the hand of those in Guatemala who favor repressive responses, even to constructive criticism and to legitimate pressures for change, end quote. This perception carried over into the ways that Guatemalan citizens reacted to the Carter administration's human rights advocacy. According to Ortiz, while Guatemalans believed that U.S. human rights policies were the primary factor in bilateral relations, those policies, quote, took on strongly negative aspects when our public condemnations run counter to Guatemalan nationalism, end quote. He also noted that the Carter administration's human rights policies simultaneously emboldened the country's far left by placing external pressures on the Lucas government for change. In his view, the best course of action for bilateral relations was to avoid overt criticism of the Lucas government's practices while working quietly to find consensus on halting Guatemala's violence and diffusing the underlying siege mentality. A second key piece of correspondence from this period highlighted how the State Department bureaucracy diluted the effectiveness of the Carter administration's human rights policies. In a letter to Ortiz from Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense John Bushnell, dated October 13, 1979, Bushnell complained that all outgoing correspondence and direction to the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City was an amalgamation of opinions from 3 separate bureaus within the State Department, as well as the White House. According to Bushnell, this impeded clear direction on how Ortiz and embassy officials should proceed on human rights and other diplomatic issues. Of particular concern to Bushnell was a misunderstanding of what State Department officials expected from Ortiz when he met with Lucas. At issue was what the State Department precisely meant in its directives on securing Lucas's cooperation on human rights. Bushnell wrote, quote, "When you are instructed to ask Lucas to make a public commitment to respect human rights and show determination to correct abuses, what we are really saying is that we need concrete actions to demonstrate a real determination to stop the killing. Broad public statements will not meet the bill because they are not credible." Quote. Despite Bushnell's clarification, his instructions remained essentially impossible to follow because the Lucas government was able to offset the loss of the Carter administration's 2 primary diplomatic inducements, military and development assistance. As previously noted, successive Guatemalan governments were able to offset U.S. military assistance by securing arms and munitions from other states and commercial merchants. Their ability to do so exposed a crucial practical flaw in the Carter administration's broader foreign policy model. Simply stated, administrative prohibitions on military assistance could only be effective if states had no recourse to procure assistance. As long as states like Israel and companies like Smith & Wesson were willing and free to do business with the Guatemalan government, U.S. arms restrictions had little effect. The IFIA's restrictions on development assistance to human rights violators were similarly ineffective in Guatemala due to the IFIA's language. Under the Act's provisions, the United States representatives in organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank were, quote, authorized and instructed to oppose any loan, any extension of financial assistance, or any technical assistance to any state judged to be in gross violation of internationally recognized human rights standards unless such assistance was directed specifically to programs which serve the basic human needs of the citizens of each country, end quote. Under these provisions, U.S. representatives approved the Inter-American Bank's $25 million loan for highway repair and the World Bank's $55 million loan for the Agua Capa Dam and reservoirs construction in 1977, and the World Bank's $72 million loan for the Chisoy River hydroelectric project in 1978. Although these projects met the IFIA's definition of basic human needs, their implementation spawned numerous human rights violations. In the case of the Chisoy Dam's construction, the Guatemalan government enacted a 6-year terror campaign to forcibly clear construction zones in 1976. As one survivor later recounted, they were strangling many of the women by putting ropes around their necks and twisting the ropes with sticks. They were also beating other women with clubs and rifles and kicking and punching them. I remember one woman. A soldier jumped up and kicked her in the back. He must have broken her spine because she tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't move. Then he smashed her skull with his rifle. The patrollers killed the children by tying ropes around their ankles and swinging them, smashing their heads and bodies into rocks and trees. Similar accounts included testimony from a survivor named Luis, who testified that he lost approximately 80 members of his family in one massacre. In all, Guatemalan armed forces killed approximately 4,000 Dachi Maya during the campaign. The loans highlighted the IFA's failure to account for violations such as this that occurred during the implementation of development projects. It also highlights absence of any recourse to rescind U.S. funding for such projects while they were ongoing. The IFIA's limitations, alongside the Harkin Amendment's ineffectiveness in halting arms sales, left Ortiz with little meaningful leverage to use with Lucas on human rights issues. Finally, a third piece of correspondence from the autumn of 1979 highlights the State Department's internal disagreements on how to define human rights and execute human rights policies. In a letter dated October 19, 1979, James Mack, the State Department's officer in charge of Guatemalan affairs, provided Ortiz with an update of intra-departmental discussions on Guatemala which focused on human rights, arms sales, and embassy reporting from Guatemala City. On the topic of human rights, Mack reported that key State Department officials, including Vakey, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs William Bowdler, and Secretary of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Patricia Darien, had recently met with members of the Guatemalan NGO Amigos del País to discuss human rights issues in Guatemala. According to Mack, quote, "In human rights conversation with the Guatemalan group, we find ourselves talking about very different aspects of the problem. The Guatemalans outlined the steps that the Guatemalan government and private sector have taken to improve social security, labor legislation, and medical care for the working class. Yet, as you know, the focus here is almost totally on the integrity of the human person type of violations, which are the fundamental cause of the difficulties in our relationship. The Guatemalans are going to have to respond to our concerns in order to make the necessary converts in the department and on the Hill." Quote. Mack also informed Ortiz that individual department bureaus were in disagreement over Guatemala's status as a human rights violator. According to Mack, the State Department's American Regional Affairs Bureau, which oversaw bilateral and regional diplomatic and consular relations, required the Lucas government to take concrete steps to halt its sanctioned violence and human rights abuses before the State Department would remove Guatemala from the list of persistent human rights violators. In contrast, the Bureau of Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights believed that under Section 116 of the Foreign Assistance Act, the Lucas government was also obligated to halt violence and abuses committed by opposition groups like ORPA and the EGP. The bureaus argued that the Lucas government's failure to stop abuses that they had not initiated was sufficient enough to keep Guatemala on the list of violator states. Mack reported that this argument had persuaded Christopher and that this decision was instrumental in refusing a proposed Inter-American Development Bank loan to Guatemala earlier in the year. Ortiz's personal feelings about Guatemalan leaders further complicated his diplomatic mission. In his correspondence, he displayed a lack of confidence in Lucas's ability to govern and personal antipathy for the Guatemalan president. In addition to the aforementioned killer president moniker, Ortiz described Lucas as, quote, "handsome, tall, broad shoulders, sort of a John Barrymore type, but a cold-blooded, vicious man with eyes like a cobra," end quote. He also expressed his doubts about Lucas's intellectual acumen, referring to him in embassy cables as, quote, "a slow-thinking, inarticulate, deliberative country boy, ill at ease with cerebral schemes, foreign ideas, and grand designs," end quote. Ortiz was also distrustful of Lucas's vice president, Francisco Villagran Kramer. Ortiz described Villagran in a State Department telegram as being, quote, "possessed of a fertile and imaginative mind, but also having a surprising lack of a sense of reality when it came to his position within Guatemala's political structure." One notable example of this came during a private lunch meeting between Ortiz and Villagran on November 9th, when Villagran asked Ortiz if the Carter administration would recognize him as president if Lucas resigned or was overthrown. Ortiz deflected the question, but noted in a State Department telegram that Villagran wildly overestimated his popularity among the country's military and political leaders, writing, quote, "Villagran's lack of a significant political base and the strong opposition to him on the part of many, if not all the political parties, would seem to make a Villagran-Kramer government one of the least likely scenarios for the future," quote. Ortiz also noted that Villagran attempted to stoke fears of another direct U.S. intervention by making public statements that the Carter administration sought to overthrow Lucas and install Villagran as president. Ortiz's challenges as ambassador were thus multifold by the end of 1979. Fundamental differences in how the US and Guatemalan governments understood human rights left the two countries at ideological cross purposes on what both sides argued was the primary issue in their diplomatic relationship. Meanwhile, Ortiz's superiors in Washington had proven incapable of offering him clear instruction on what they expected from him as ambassador or how they expected him to do it. Finally, his working relationships with Lucas and Villagran were hampered by his personal dislike and distrust of both men. These difficulties prevented Ortiz from taking any meaningful action on human rights as the Lucas government's repression worsened and intensified into 1980. The most infamous of these abuses occurred on January 31st, 1980, when 39 protesters from the Comité de Campesina and Frente Estudiantil Revolucionario Robin Garcia organizations and indigenous campesinos from the Department of Quiché entered the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City to call increased attention to the Lucas regime's abuses. Fearful of the consequences that a public demonstration would bring, the protesters decided to occupy an embassy as they felt its extraterritorial status would protect them from government reprisal. Instead, military and police forces, acting on the Lucas government's orders, threw a firebomb through a skylight on the embassy roof and prevented firefighters from extinguishing the blaze. 38 of the protesters were burned alive in the fire on live television, while the lone survivor, Gregorio Yulo, was abducted from his bed in the Herrera Llorandi hospital the following evening by masked gunmen, executed and dumped in front of San Carlos University in the city's 12th zone. The Spanish Embassy massacre was part of a surge in violence across the country in 1980. In addition to the embassy murders, 46 total massacres, such as those carried out in the villages of Cocop, Nebaj, and San Juan Cotzal in July and August, were recorded during the year. In addition to these massacres, 32 people were kidnapped from Guatemala City's Parque Centenario during a May Day demonstration organized by the Comité Nacional de Unidad Sindical. 27 Central Nacional de Trabajadores members were abducted on June 21st, while police abducted another 17 CNT labor leaders from 3 factories in Esquintla on August 24th. These kidnappings were part of a larger attempt to cripple the country's labor movement. In all, 110 labor leaders were killed during the year. Some 2,264 people were murdered or disappeared in 1980, almost doubling the previous year's total of 1,371. These events prompted Ortiz to issue a lengthy cable in June 1980 in which he warned the State Department that Guatemala was, quote, a bloodbath waiting to happen. He attributed this in large part to ongoing political violence in El Salvador and Nicaragua, which, he claimed, fueled Guatemalan rightists' siege mentality to a, quote, paranoid state where they react violently, almost hysterically, unquote. He also relayed his fear that the country's extreme right seemed capable of emerging in wholesale atrocities at the slightest provocation. Ortiz was especially concerned about the potential for such violence in Guatemala City, which was home for most of the country's 11,000 US citizens. All of this contributed to a diplomatic impasse. As Ortiz noted, the Carter administration could not support a regime engaged in widespread human rights abuses. Neither could it fully abandon its support of the Lucas government without contributing to its siege mentality and paranoia, or without appearing to sanction Marxist groups in the country that had received financial and logistical support from Cuban leader Fidel Castro and Nicaragua's Sandinista government since the mid-1970s. For Ortiz, the Carter administration's only viable solution remained a, quote, non-confrontational posture of unmistakable support for the essential political freedoms and those factors essential to the functioning of a modern representational democracy, unquote. He argued that this policy embodied the essence of American political values that the world expected from US diplomacy and also contributed to the Carter administration's desired image as facilitators of internal change rather than one of foreign interventionists. Ortiz's proposed diplomatic strategy, alongside Guatemala's increasing violence and the bureaucratic impediments he faced as ambassador, led some critics to charge that he was either incapable of or uninterested in helping to stop the violence. One such criticism came from the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, a Washington-based NGO focused on economic, political, and human rights practices in the Americas. In a press release from its director, Larry Burns, the organization excoriated Ortiz for being, quote, unable to adequately recognize a situation where more people are being killed in absolute terms every day than in any other country in the hemisphere. Regrettably, Ortiz has become an apologist for one of the most miserable governments in the region, end quote. Ortiz also faced strong criticism from key congressional leaders. On June 10th, Harkin sent a letter directly to President Carter in which he sharply criticized Ortiz's record as ambassador in contrast with the United States' ambassadors to Nicaragua and El Salvador, Lawrence Pezzullo and Robert White. Harkin wrote, quote, all of my contacts in Nicaragua involved in the human rights efforts claim that Ambassador Ortiz is well known to be on the side of the repressive right-wing element of Guatemala. I contrast this with my friends in El Salvador and Nicaragua who do not say these same things about Larry Pezzullo or Bob White, end quote. Harkin concluded his letter by lobbying Carter to remove Ortiz from his post, stating that the administration's ambassador to Guatemala, quote, should certainly be making more inroads and contacts with the popular and democratic forces in the country, end quote. Mack forwarded a copy of Harkin's letter to Ortiz, and Ortiz responded directly to Harkin in a sharply worded letter on June 26th. Ortiz alluded to the administrative impediments he encountered in his posting, stating, quote, you apparently have preferences as to governments. While you do, the ambassador does not. He has to operate in the situation in which he finds himself and seek to exert maximum influence always in the advancement of American interests, end quote. He called Harkin's allegations, quote, malevolently wrong, and stated that Harkin would issue a complete retraction of his claims if Harkin was, quote, an honorable man. While Ortiz's letter to Harkin was contentious, it retained the measured, painstakingly deliberative prose that marked all of Ortiz's cables and policy papers throughout his career. In contrast, a second letter from that day, addressed to Special Assistant to the President for Hispanic Affairs, Esteban Torres, was absent any pretense and is notable for its visceral tone. Referring to his friend Torres as hermano, Ortiz levied a striking charge against the State Department and Carter administration, stating, quote, I hope you can take appropriate steps in the White House to assure that all this is viewed for what it is, a calculated effort to knock off a Hispanic who will call the shots as he sees them, end quote. Reports of Ortiz's impending recall began to circulate in both the U.S. and Guatemalan press in late June. On June 28th, the New York Times reported that Ortiz was to be replaced as ambassador shortly following what the story described as, quote, a bitter internal debate over United States policy toward Guatemala. The story, which ran on the newspaper's front page, cited an anonymous high-ranking State Department official who stated that, quote, it had long been obvious that Mr. Ortiz's analysis of the Guatemalan situation was not shared by other administration specialists, end quote. The U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City confirmed Ortiz's recall in a July 2nd press briefing and stated that his departure was part of, quote, many changes to the regional diplomatic corps. On July 3rd, the Guatemala City newspaper La Tarde ran a pair of stories on Ortiz's recall and noted Guatemalan political leaders' surprise at the news. Guatemalan congressman and Partido Social Democrático member Julio Alegría Ceniz expressed surprise at the brevity of Ortiz's posting, while Leonel Cisniega Ortega, head of the ultra-rightist Movimiento Liberación Nacional party, expressed his hope that, quote, the new ambassador does not become a scourge on Guatemala like Bowler or Pezzullo, end quote. Prensa Libre condemned Ortiz's recall in its July 4th edition and blamed his removal on what it described as a, quote, interventionist and messianic U.S. foreign policy that had failed to gain traction in Guatemala, El Salvador, or Nicaragua. Finally, the Washington Post reported on July 28th that Ortiz's recall was part of a broader diplomatic reorganization that included ambassadorial changes in Argentina, Colombia, Honduras, Paraguay, and Uruguay throughout the summer. Ortiz was officially recalled on August 6th and was temporarily assigned to the United States Southern Command in Panama as chief political advisor before being named U.S. ambassador to Peru in 1981. Following a 2-year stay in Lima, Ortiz served his final posting as ambassador to Argentina from 1983 to 1986. He returned to Santa Fe in 1986, where he remained until his death in 2005. Many of Ortiz's insights proved tragically accurate. Absent any meaningful diplomatic incentive to halt its abuses, the Lucas government's repression increased in 1981, with 3,426 recorded incidents of murder and forced disappearance and 103 recorded massacres that year alone. These totals increased exponentially under Lucas's successor, General Jose Efrain Rios Montt. Between 1980 and 1983, the Lucas and Rios Montt governments killed over 23,000 Guatemalan citizens and pursued a genocide campaign in the country's Ixil region. Guatemala's ongoing human rights atrocities remained a primary concern in bilateral relations for the Ronald Reagan administration, which attempted to balance Guatemala's human rights abuses with similar crises in El Salvador and Nicaragua. The Guatemalan government's human rights abuses began to subside in the mid-1980s, but continued through the war's end in 1996. Ultimately, the core issues that precipitated both the diplomatic tensions between the US and Guatemala during the late 1970s and Ortiz's recall were well established prior to his nomination as ambassador. The Lagarud and Lucas governments perceived Carter's human rights rhetoric and his administration's insistence on a human rights-based foreign policy as US interference in Guatemala's sovereign domestic affairs. Considering the United States' historical intervention in Guatemalan politics and economics during the Cold War, any suggestion of the Carter administration's imposition on Guatemala's domestic affairs would likely have been a point of diplomatic contention by the late 1970s. The State Department and Congress's lack of consensus on how to define human rights and how to best engage the Guatemalan government on its abuses also contributed to Ortiz's recall. As late as 1979, State Department officials' definition of human rights did not match that of other governments in the hemisphere and left the United States, quote, fundamentally out of phase with regional allies on the Carter administration's cornerstone foreign policy issue. Opaque communication from State Department officials in Washington to Ortiz in Guatemala further complicated an already tense relationship with the Lucas government. Finally, engagement with the Guatemalan government on human rights issues proved counterproductive because, as Ortiz had warned, the Carter administration had no meaningful diplomatic leverage to effect change. The administration's primary tactic, restricting military assistance, had no effect because the Lagarud and Lucas governments were able to offset that loss via increased aid from other sources, as well as such as foreign states and commercial transactions with private contractors. Similarly, the Inter-American Development and World Bank's loans to Guatemala proceeded without any reduction in Guatemalans' human rights abuses. In fact, Guatemala's human rights record worsened during this period. In both cases, the Carter administration's inducements failed because the Guatemalan government was able to secure assistance from other states and in the process emphasized the limits of US diplomatic influence. While Ortiz's efforts to bring about lasting change in Guatemala failed, bureaucratic, ideological, and practical circumstances in both Guatemala and Washington effectively made this an impossibility. Reconsidering his ambassadorship under these broader historical circumstances foregrounds US policymakers' inability to fully integrate human rights advocacy into foreign policy and also highlights the complexities of US-Guatemalan relations during the 1970s and 1980s. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I understand the distinction between the U.S. perspective on human rights and the Latin American perspective. Can you restate that?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, by the 1970s, and this is a product of the longer Cold War debate over human rights within foreign policy. The simplest way to frame it is that the United States privileged civil and political liberties as the bedrock of what the State Department considered human rights. In contrast, especially in Latin America, economic and social equality and justice were considered to be more imperative in terms of how those states defined human rights. One of the reasons for that actually goes back to right after World War II. John Dulles, in the late 1940s, openly pushed the United States and the State Department away from using economic and social justice as sort of these buzzwords within its definition of human rights to draw a distinction between the Soviet bloc. And one of the ways that it's often been described as empires of liberty versus empires of justice. And you really see that, especially in Latin America by the late 1970s, that economic and social rights concerns really were more paramount than political. Yes?
Staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Yes.
During this period, for my portfolio didn't involve Latin America. And do you see any way for the Congress to exert more influence on issues like this? I remember Congressman Frazier was very active in Korea and had was very active on this issue. The ability to influence foreign policy is somewhat limited if you have other actors.
Yes, absolutely.
People that supply the arms.
Yes, absolutely.
We couldn't hear the question, this question.
Yeah. We are. I think our battery died again. We'll hold it up. All right. So the question was.
Seth.
The question was, if I may rephrase it, was there any possible way for Congress and legislators to really exert an influential role in foreign policy and human rights? Is that a fair restatement? The answer is yes and no. And I think this speaks to one of the larger underlying topics here today, is that foreign policy is just exceedingly bureaucratic. And there are so many hands, in the policy-making pot that, while Congress in the late 1970s really fought to reassert some modicum of influence over human rights legislation and foreign policy, that was actually what I would say was a bigger push by Congress to reassert its power following Watergate and the Nixon administration. Under Nixon, William Rogers, who was Secretary of State, was almost shut completely out of foreign policy formation within the Nixon administration. It was almost a two-man show between Nixon and Kissinger as National Security Advisor. So following Nixon's resignation, you really saw Congress attempt to really reassert that, sort of treaty-making power, which it is allowed under the Constitution, but had taken away from them over the course of the 1960s and early part of the 70s. As to whether they could have ever been full and equal partners, I would say that they had their best opportunity to do that under the Carter administration, because the Carter administration was, made human rights a cornerstone of its foreign policy, but established bureaucracy within the policy-making community really kept that in check. Is that? Yes.
Well, I can phrase this. Why is it on this end? We're constantly being told that these are left revolutions and Congress can take over all of Central America. And yet, if you travel there, the story is completely different.
So the question was, why is the U.S. perspective on this that human rights and Central American governments were being infiltrated by the left and Marxists?
Well, that's the perspective we were fed.
Right, exactly. Yes. Yeah, that's the perspective we were fed. And yes, you are correct in that that is absolutely not the case if you go elsewhere. If I had an answer to that, I wouldn't have to do this for a living. But in all seriousness, I mean, that is one of the fundamental issues that, my research really attempts to unpack. One of the things that really I think contributes to that is that until the 1970s, specifically the late 1970s, the foreign policy apparatus within the United States was very bifurcated. It was very black and white. It was either or. It was US or Soviet. And what you saw in the mid to late 1970s was sort of this emergence of what we used to call the third world, and now we call the global south. And what you saw was that, especially with human rights, you saw the emergence of something that was neither fish nor fowl. It was somewhere in between. It didn't totally privilege these sort of bedrock democratic free market capitalist notions that the State Department and the Western world really championed, but at the same time it stopped very short of being all the way to the left. It was somewhere in the middle. The Catholic Church actually emerged as a very central proponent of that through its liberalization throughout the first half of the 20th century. As far as why that was fed to the the U.S. public, we'd be here for a week trying to unpack that, to give some sort of sensible answer.
Would you want to give the audience the total figure of people who were massacred in Guatemala alone?
Between 1960 and 1996, the best estimates, and I'll explain that in a moment, the best estimates were 250,000 dead in 36 years, which put another way is approximately 5 times the number of U.S. servicemen killed during the Vietnam War, to put it in some context. The reason why I gave the caveat of best estimate is that they're still finding mass graves in Guatemala. That also, I would like to point out, that figure does not include refugees and displaced persons. Our best estimates of that number is anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million Guatemalans who had to flee their homes at some point as a result of the violence, either to other countries or within Guatemala. Yes?
What total population in Guatemala during that period?
During that period, I think it was somewhere between 15 and 20 million off the top of my head. So we're talking approximately 5 to 6% of the entire population was either killed or displaced as a result of the violence. Yes, in back.
In your opinion, excuse me, in your opinion, which is more effective, the realpolitik of someone such as Henry Kissinger, or the idealistic foreign policy of someone such as Carter?
In true diplomatic fashion, I'm going to say somewhere in the middle, and I'll explain why. One of the things, specifically within the history profession, and within the academy, is that one of the big sort of historiographical developments that we've had is that up until about the mid to late 1990s, historians and policymakers typically looked at foreign policy and international relations almost exclusively on the state level, so sort of looking down, right? And it wasn't until recently that scholars figured out that state policies are very important, but real change happens on the local level, right? But you really can't have one without the other. So that is really a very long and convoluted way to answer your question, which is states set the policies, which can be either incredibly productive or counterproductive, but at the same time, as I think our example today shows, diplomats and functionaries that actually have to carry out that policy around the globe really don't have a lot of say in the political environments that they have to execute those policies in. So idealism is great, as is statecraft, but I think you need both, and they both need to be in balance. Yes?
At any time, was there any danger to Ambassador Ortiz or the embassy?
Yes, in fact. According to Ambassador Ortiz's memoirs, I think it was his second day as ambassador in Guatemala City, he received a notification that he was on a list of persons to be killed. And he did, throughout his memoirs, consistently refer to his posting in Guatemala as the least enjoyable in his career because of the violence and because of the constant threats. As I recall, he noted in his memoirs that he initially did not bring his children to post in Guatemala City for just that reason. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think he did the right thing in going by what he thought the situation, from his perspective. He didn't agree with everything the State Department or the political people were, trying to carry on.
Yes, exactly. And that really speaks to one of the larger sort of push and pull type of issues within foreign policy and within diplomacy, is that the State Department in Washington and the White House and Congress, in all of these various bodies, they set the tone for what policy is, but they aren't the ones that physically have to execute it in every embassy, in virtually every country around the globe. And it's impossible, to create a one-size-fits-all policy that, would just be applicable anywhere. There's always going to be local contingencies and local exigencies that are going to force ambassadors like Ortiz to really be between, diplomatically speaking, a rock and a hard place. So I think that, one of the things that, if you take anything away from this, one of the things that I would like for you to take away is that, to the question of why does this matter, this one diplomat in this one post in this one time in this one country, why does it matter? It matters because when he was recalled from his post and effectively fired as ambassador, the public explanation was that he was simply just too close to the Lucas government, personally and professionally, to really do what the Carter administration wanted him to do. Hopefully what I've shown is that, in the most basic sense possible, that was almost impossible. Yeah. Yes?
One comment on what we've talked about here in a specific period. And now we come to current President Guatemala in jail.
Yes, he is.
Why? Leave that to you.
You didn't hear.
I'll be as tactful as I can in answering.
Please repeat the question.
The question was how much has really changed from 1980 to 2016, considering that the sitting president of Guatemala was thrown in prison about 6 months ago as being part of a massive corruption racket. So the question is, what's changed? And I really don't want to send you out of here on kind of a no, but the answer is not a lot. You still have rampant political corruption, a lot of graft. There's institutionalized racism, if we're being honest, against the country's indigenous majority population. And although there is, on a personal level, a lot of openness and a lot of willingness to talk about what happened, there's just as much hesitancy to admit what happened. A perfect example I can give you is that my last trip down to do archival work, I was in Guatemala City for a couple of weeks doing research at the National Police Archive. And I had a cab driver who drove me back and forth from my hotel to the archive on a daily basis. And every day he would tell me that Rios Montt was the greatest president that Guatemala had ever had because he kept all the communists in line and running for their lives. But, on the same token, his second favorite Guatemalan president ever was Arbenz. Which is just polar opposites. Arbenz was overthrown by the CIA for his suspected communist affiliation. So on the one hand, his favorite president was roughly to the right of Attila the Hun, and his second favorite president was all the way to the left as you could possibly get in the, at the time. So that's a lot of mental gymnastics, especially at 7:30 in the morning. Guatemala is still really reconciling. To put it another way, the war ended in 1996. So what that means is that the entire population, anybody that's roughly over the age of 25, has firsthand memories of the war. That's pretty significant. And I would like to think that things are getting better. As a younger generation of Guatemalans emerges, you do see wholesale rejections of corruption and graft that have marked Guatemalan politics since 1821. So, not much has changed yet. How's that? Thank you.